My name is Philomena, and I'm 31 years old. All my life, I've tried to live up to my mother's impossible standards, always falling short in her critical eyes. At my in law's anniversary dinner last year, she finally went too far, loudly declaring me a failure forever in front of everyone I love. As I sat there, hands trembling against the fine china, something inside me broke free. That night, I told a truth our family had buried for decades, and the words that came out changed everything. Before I share what happened that night, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand up to toxic family, and stick around to hear how I finally freed myself from decades of shame. My relationship with my mother has always been complicated. Janet Miller was born into privilege, the only daughter of a prominent judge and a socialite mother. From the day I was born, she viewed me as an extension of herself rather than my own person, a vessel to achieve all the things she felt she should have accomplished in her own life. Growing up in our spacious colonial home in Connecticut, I learned early that love from my mother was conditional on my performance. Janet had a mental checklist for everything: grades, appearance, social connections, extracurricular activities, and I never quite measured up. Philomena, an A minus, might as well be a C in this family, she would say, pushing my report card away as if it were contaminated. The Millers don't accept mediocrity. When I won second place in the regional spelling bee at age 10, she didn't congratulate me. Instead, she spent the car ride home listing all the words I should have studied more carefully. "Winners find a way to come in first," she said. "Remember that, Philomena." My father, Robert, was my quiet ally. A gentle intellectual man who worked as a university professor. He would slip into my room after these lectures to offer comfort. "Your mother just wants what's best for you," he would say, squeezing my shoulder. "She doesn't always know how to show it." But Robert never directly challenged Janet. When her criticism crossed into cruelty, he would simply leave the room, retreating to his study, where classical music and books provided an escape from the tension. His absence was another kind of pain, the silent acknowledgement that I wasn't worth fighting for. By the time I reached middle school, I had developed severe anxiety. I would stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning completing homework assignments, then redo them if they weren't perfect. I monitored my food intake obsessively after Janet commented that I was developing a little pudge around the middle. I chose friends based on whether my mother would approve of their families. "You'll thank me someday," Janet would say when I cried over her criticisms. "The world is harsh and I'm preparing you for it. Would you rather I lie to you like the parents of all those mediocre children?" My younger sister Grace seemed to glide through life collecting the approval I could never earn. 3 years my junior, she was naturally inclined toward the things my mother valued: mathematics, sciences, debate team. She had our mother's willowy frame and perfect posture, while I took after my father's side with curves and a tendency to slouch when nervous. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" became a refrain I heard so often it echoed in my dreams. I tried not to resent Grace. It wasn't her fault she fit so perfectly into the mold I kept breaking. Sometimes when Janet was particularly cruel, Grace would slip into my room at night with cookies she'd snuck from the kitchen, or a funny drawing to make me smile. But our relationship was strained by the constant comparison, the unspoken competition for our mother's approval, that Grace always won. The defining moment came during my senior year of high school. Despite maintaining a 4.0 GPA and participating in all the right activities, I had developed a passion for art that consumed me. Hours that should have been spent on SAT prep or college applications disappeared into my sketchbook. I found peace in the stroke of a brush that I'd never experienced anywhere else. When I announced my intention to apply to art school instead of the Ivy League universities Janet had selected, the explosion was nuclear. "Art, art, that's your grand plan for the future." Janet's voice had risen to a pitch I'd never heard before. "Artists starve, Philomena. Artists beg for scraps. No daughter of mine will throw her life away on some childish hobby." "It's not a hobby, Mom. It's what I love. It's what I'm good at." My voice had trembled, but I stood my ground. Love doesn't pay bills, and you're good at plenty of things that could lead to an actual career: law, medicine, even business, though the hours would probably be too demanding for someone with your lack of discipline. For weeks, the house was a war zone. Janet alternated between icy silence and blistering tirades. Robert made weak attempts at mediation before retreating again. Grace watched wide-eyed from the periphery, suddenly seeing a future where she might also be expected to sacrifice her own dreams. In the end, I compromised, agreeing to double major in graphic design and marketing at a well-regarded university. Janet considered it a temporary detour, convinced I would come to my senses and pursue an MBA or law degree after graduation. But art had become my lifeline, my authentic voice in a world where I'd been trained to echo others. And despite my mother's predictions of failure, it eventually led me to the life and the love I never knew I deserved. I met Daniel Cooper at a small gallery in Brooklyn, where 3 of my paintings were being displayed as part of a showcase for emerging artists. He stood for nearly 30 minutes in front of my largest piece, an abstract representation of breaking free that I'd titled Emergence, before approaching me at the wine table. "Your work is extraordinary," he said, his warm brown eyes crinkling at the corners. "The way you layer color to create depth. It's like you're inviting the viewer to fall into another dimension." No one had ever understood my art so intuitively before. My mother dismissed it as splashes of color any child could make. My father politely commented on the interesting use of space without further elaboration. But Daniel saw what I was trying to communicate. Our conversation flowed effortlessly from art to music to books. By the end of the evening, we had plans for dinner the following night. 3 months later, we were inseparable. Daniel was everything I hadn't realized I was looking for: creative, supportive, and unfailingly kind. As a successful architect, he understood the balance between artistic vision and practical application. More importantly, he valued my work without reservation. "You have a unique perspective, Phil," he would say, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "The world needs your art." Meeting his family was a revelation. Thomas and Martha Cooper welcomed me into their home as if they'd been waiting for me all along. Their modest house in New Jersey was filled with laughter, honest conversation, and unconditional acceptance. "We're so happy Daniel found you," Martha told me during my first visit, squeezing my hand warmly. "Anyone who puts that light in our son's eyes is family to us." Thomas, a retired carpenter, showed genuine interest in my art, asking thoughtful questions about my process and influences. When I hesitantly mentioned an upcoming small exhibition, both of them immediately marked it on their calendar and promised to be there. The contrast between the Coopers' warm acceptance and my own family's critical assessment was startling. With Daniel's parents, I could relax, speak freely, even disagree without fear of rejection. With my own, especially Janet, I remained perpetually on guard, measuring every word and action against her potential disapproval. When Daniel proposed after a year of dating, Janet's response was predictably underwhelming. "Well, at least he has a real career," she said when I called with the news. "Though I always pictured you with someone from a more established family. What did you say his parents do again?" "His father was a carpenter, and his mother taught elementary school," I replied, already feeling the familiar tightness in my chest. Well, I suppose what matters is that he can provide for you. You certainly can't expect to support yourself with those paintings." The wedding planning became a battleground. Janet pushed for an elaborate country club affair with hundreds of guests, many of whom I barely knew. I wanted something smaller, more personal, that reflected Daniel and me as a couple. For the first time, I found myself consistently standing up to her, small acts of rebellion that built my confidence. I chose a bohemian dress instead of the traditional ball gown she preferred. I selected wildflowers instead of the formal arrangements she insisted were appropriate. I refused to invite her social circle acquaintances who had never been part of my life. Each decision was met with passive-aggressive comments and dramatic sighs, but with Daniel's support, I held firm. By the time our wedding day arrived, I had won most of the battles, though the war left me emotionally exhausted. The ceremony itself was beautiful, a garden wedding at a historic inn with just 80 of our closest friends and family. Janet maintained a tight smile throughout, offering backhanded compliments at the reception. "The dress is certainly unique," she said, eyeing my flowing off-shoulder gown. "Not what I would have chosen, but it suits your artistic sensibilities, I suppose." And later to one of her friends, "Yes, the venue is charming in a rustic way. Philomena never did appreciate the finer things, despite my best efforts. But with Daniel by my side, her barbs couldn't penetrate the joy of the day. For once, I was the center of a celebration that honored who I truly was, not who someone else wanted me to be. Our early marriage was a revelation. Daniel and I created a home that was our sanctuary, filled with art music and genuine conversations. My career as an artist began to gain traction with regular exhibitions at local galleries and a growing client base for commissioned works. When I became pregnant with our daughter Lily, 2 years after our wedding, I experienced a surge of both joy and terror. What kind of mother would I be? Would I unconsciously replicate the critical relationship I had with Janet? I spent hours in therapy working through these fears, determined to break the cycle. The day Lily was born, pink-cheeked and perfectly imperfect with her father's dimples and my unruly hair, I made a silent promise to her. She would grow up knowing she was loved exactly as she was. Her worth would never be tied to her achievements. Janet predictably had opinions about my parenting. When I chose to breastfeed beyond 6 months, she called it unnecessary and attention-seeking. When I played classical music in the nursery, she criticized that I wasn't also incorporating mathematics instruction. When Lily showed an early interest in finger painting, Janet suggested I focus on developing her verbal skills instead. Children need structure and correction, Philomena, she would say during her infrequent visits. You're raising her to be soft in a hard world. Each criticism reopened old wounds, but motherhood had given me a new perspective. I could now see clearly how damaging Janet's parenting had been, and I was fiercely determined to protect Lily from the same experience. What I didn't realize was that all these small acts of defiance, my art, my marriage, my parenting choices, were building toward a reckoning that would finally break the chains of my mother's disapproval. The invitation arrived on heavy cream cardstock with a gold embossed border, a 40th anniversary celebration for Thomas and Martha Cooper, 40 years of partnership, friendship, and growth together. It was a milestone that deserved recognition, and Daniel was determined to make it special for his parents. They want a small dinner at the house, he explained. Just family and a few close friends, maybe 20 people total. My stomach tightened when he added, they specifically asked that your parents come too. They want to get to know them better. The Coopers had met my parents only twice, at our wedding and again briefly when Lily was born. Both encounters had been cordial but strained, with Janet making subtle comments about the quaint ceremony and the unusual name we'd chosen for our daughter. Are you sure that's a good idea? I asked, already imagining the dozens of ways Janet could ruin the evening. Daniel squeezed my hand. They want to try Phil, and it's important to them. We can manage one evening, right? I agreed reluctantly, calling my parents to extend the invitation. Robert answered, sounding genuinely pleased to be included. Janet, who took the phone from him mid-conversation, was more measured in her response. An anniversary dinner. How lovely. Though I'm surprised they're not doing something more substantial for such a significant milestone. When your father and I reached 40 years, we renewed our vows in Tuscany. I bit back a retort about how different the two marriages were. One built on control and appearances, the other on genuine partnership and respect. Instead, I simply confirmed the details and ended the call as quickly as possible. The evening of the celebration arrived with perfect early fall weather, crisp and clear, with leaves just beginning to turn. Daniel and I arrived early to help with final preparations. Lily excited to spend time with her beloved grandparents. Thomas and Martha's home looked beautiful. They had strung white lights in the backyard oak trees and set up a long table on the patio decorated with candles and fresh flowers from Martha's garden. Inside, photographs from their 40 years together covered the living room walls, a visual journey of a life well lived and deeply loved. This is perfect, I told Martha as I helped arrange name cards at each place setting. Simple and elegant, just like you two. She smiled, squeezing my arm affectionately. The older I get, the more I realize that the people around the table matter far more than what's on it. My parents arrived exactly on time, Janet surveying the home with the subtle scrutiny I recognized all too well. She wore an expensive black dress with pearl accessories, significantly more formal than the garden party attire the invitation had suggested. What a charming little place, she said, the familiar coded language making me tense immediately. You've done so much with the space available. Martha, either missing or choosing to ignore the condescension, thanked her warmly. We've been here for 35 years now, raised our 2 children in this house. It's not grand, but it's full of love and memories. Indeed, Janet replied with a tight smile. Sometimes sentiment must take precedence over aesthetics. I exchanged glances with Daniel, who subtly rolled his eyes and squeezed my hand in solidarity. His sister Kate arrived next with her husband Sam, followed by Thomas's brother and his wife, and a few longtime friends of the Coopers. The gathering was intimate and warm, with genuine laughter and conversation flowing easily. For the first hour, everything went surprisingly well. Janet was on her best behavior, engaging politely, if somewhat stiffly, with the other guests. Robert seemed to be genuinely enjoying himself deep in conversation with Thomas about their shared interest in jazz music. I began to relax, thinking perhaps I had catastrophized unnecessarily. Maybe Janet would surprise me by being pleasant for the entire evening. That hope evaporated when Martha proudly led everyone into the dining room, where a large landscape painting hung on the feature wall. Philomena painted this for our 30th anniversary, she explained to the group. It's our favorite view from the lake house we used to rent every summer when the kids were young. She captured it perfectly from just a few old photographs in our descriptions. It's the centerpiece of our home, Thomas added, smiling at me warmly. A true family treasure. I felt a flush of pleasure at their praise, followed immediately by the familiar tension, as Janet studied the painting with a critical eye. It's very colorful, she said finally. Philomena always did have an interest in creative hobbies. I had hoped she would channel that creativity into something more substantial, but I suppose there's value in these pursuits as well. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. It's not a hobby, Mrs. Miller, Martha said gently but firmly. Philomena is a genuinely talented artist. We're actually incredibly proud of her upcoming exhibition. Janet's head swiveled toward me sharply. Exhibition? What exhibition? I hadn't told my parents about the solo show a prestigious Brooklyn gallery had offered me. After years of their dismissal of my art, I had stopped sharing my professional achievements with them, tired of the inevitable undermining comments. The Westbridge Gallery is featuring my work next month, I explained, trying to keep my voice casual. It's a pretty big opportunity. And you didn't think to mention this to your own parents. Janet's voice had that dangerous edge I recognized from childhood, the prelude to a storm. I was waiting for the right time, I said, aware of how flimsy the excuse sounded. The right time, Janet repeated coldly. I see. Thomas, sensing the growing tension, attempted to steer the conversation to safer waters. Should we move to the living room for drinks before dinner? Martha has prepared her famous cranberry spritzers. The group migrated back to the living room, but the easy atmosphere of earlier had evaporated. Janet positioned herself next to me, speaking in a low voice only I could hear. So you share your accomplishments with these people, but not your own family. Is that the kind of daughter I raised? Mom, please, I whispered. Not tonight. This is a celebration for Thomas and Martha. Precisely why you should have told us about this exhibition beforehand, she hissed. Now I look like a fool who knows nothing about her own daughter's life. Daniel approached with drinks, his eyes questioning as he registered the tension between us. I gave him a reassuring smile that didn't reach my eyes, accepting the glass with a slightly trembling hand. Everything okay? He murmured. Fine, I lied, just catching Mom up on the exhibition news. But I could feel the familiar anxiety building, the tightness in my chest, warning of the storm gathering on the horizon. And as Martha called everyone to the dining table, I couldn't shake the feeling that the evening was about to take a devastating turn. The dining room looked magical in the soft glow of candles and subtle overhead lighting. Martha had outdone herself with the dinner spread. Roast lamb with rosemary colorful vegetable sides, freshly baked bread, and a selection of wines chosen specifically for the occasion. The table settings were elegant without being ostentatious. Fine china that had been passed down through Thomas's family paired with simple linen napkins and Martha's grandmother's silver. Janet took her assigned seat with a rigid posture that signaled her continuing displeasure. I was placed between Daniel and Kate with Janet directly across from me, a seating arrangement that now felt like a tactical error. Every time I looked up, I met her critical gaze, her eyes boring into me with silent accusation. Thomas rose to make a toast, his glass raised as he looked lovingly at Martha. 40 years ago, I married my best friend. He began, his voice warm with emotion. Every day since has been an adventure I wouldn't trade for anything. Martha, you are the heart of our family, the center of our home, and still the most beautiful woman I've ever known. Martha blushed, reaching for his hand, as the table responded with a chorus of "hear, hear," and the gentle clinking of glasses. And I want to add, Thomas continued, how grateful we are to be surrounded by family tonight, both the family we were born with and the family we've chosen. Martha and I consider ourselves blessed that our son found Philomena and brought her into our lives. The warmth of his words wrapped around me like a blanket, momentarily shielding me from Janet's icy stare. Daniel squeezed my knee under the table, his touch a silent affirmation of his father's sentiment. The moment of peace was shattered by Janet's voice cutting through the warm atmosphere like a cold wind. Yes, real family is so important, isn't it? Those blood connections that can never truly be replaced, no matter how convenient other relationships might be. An uncomfortable silence followed her comment. Martha, ever the gracious hostess, attempted to move past the awkward moment by suggesting everyone begin eating while the food was hot. Conversation resumed, though noticeably more subdued than before. When the topic turned to Lily's recent achievements in preschool, I felt myself relaxing, slightly happy to discuss my daughter's budding interest in storytelling and her impressive vocabulary. She's already reading simple books, Daniel said proudly. Phil works with her every evening. They have this whole routine with voices for different characters. That's wonderful, Martha exclaimed. She's clearly inherited her mother's creativity and intelligence. Janet's laugh was sharp and without humor. Well, let's hope she's inherited more than that. Some practical skills would serve her better in the long run. What do you mean by that, Mrs. Miller? Daniel asked, his tone remaining polite, though I could hear the undercurrent of tension. Simply that while creativity is charming in a child, it doesn't necessarily translate to success in adulthood, Janet replied smoothly. My other grandchildren, Grace's twins, are already enrolled in an advanced mathematics program. Structure and discipline lay the foundation for real achievement. I felt my chest tighten at the familiar comparison. Even my daughter wasn't exempt from being measured against her cousins and found wanting. I think Lily is doing wonderfully, Thomas interjected firmly. And Philomena and Daniel are excellent parents who know what's best for their child. Janet's smile didn't reach her eyes. Of course they are. I just find it interesting how history repeats itself. Philomena was also a creative child, always with her head in the clouds. We tried to channel that energy into more productive avenues. Remember how we enrolled you in pre-med courses that summer before college, Philomena? Such a waste when you abandoned all of that for… What was it called? Ah, yes. Finding yourself through art. The table grew quiet again. I stared down at my plate, appetite gone, as familiar shame crawled up my throat. Philomena is an accomplished artist, Martha said, her usual gentle voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. Her work has been featured in multiple galleries and publications. That's hardly finding herself. That's building a successful career, doing what she loves. Janet waved a dismissive hand. Oh, I'm sure it's very fulfilling on a personal level. But let's be honest. It's not exactly the kind of stable, respectable career we had hoped for when we invested so much in her education. Mom, I said quietly, willing my voice not to shake, this isn't the time or place for this discussion. When is the time, Philomena? Janet's voice rose slightly. You clearly don't communicate with us about important events in your life. You've chosen to surround yourself with people who encourage your impractical pursuits rather than pushing you toward your potential. I could feel every eye at the table on me, the weight of their attention pressing down like a physical force. Daniel's hand found mine under the table, his touch grounding me as the room seemed to tilt. Janet, Robert began, his voice carrying a rare note of warning. That's enough. But Janet, perhaps emboldened by the wine or simply no longer able to maintain her facade of polite disapproval, was not finished. She laughed, a brittle sound that cut through the tension like glass. Enough. I've spent years watching my daughter squander her gifts, settle for mediocrity when she could have been exceptional. And now she's raising her child to follow the same path. She looked directly at me, her eyes cold and hard. Let's be honest, everyone. Philomena has always been and will always be a failure. It's just who she is. The words hung in the air, a thunderclap in the stunned silence that followed. I felt as if I'd been slapped, my cheeks burning with humiliation and anger. My hands began to tremble so violently that I had to set down my fork to avoid dropping it. Robert's face had drained of color. "Janet, that's enough." He repeated, his voice stronger now, but still ineffectual against my mother's tirade. Janet seemed to take his intervention as encouragement to continue. "Is it enough, Robert? Our daughter deliberately keeps us at arm's length, shares her accomplishments with strangers instead of her family, raises our grandchild with no sense of discipline or ambition, and we're supposed to smile and pretend everything is fine." She turned her attention back to me, beginning to list what she perceived as my lifetime of failures. The medical school I didn't attend, the law career I didn't pursue, the real job I'd never held, the social connections I'd failed to maintain. As she spoke, something shifted inside me. The trembling in my hands continued, but it no longer felt like weakness. It felt like energy, like something long dormant was awakening. I carefully set down my water glass, pushed back my chair, and slowly stood up. The room fell instantly silent. All eyes turned toward me as I stood, my hands still shaking visibly against the white tablecloth. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, feel the heat of shame and anger flushing my cheeks. But underneath those familiar sensations was something new, a calm certainty, a knowledge that this moment had been decades in the making. I took a deep breath and released it slowly, centering myself before speaking. "First," I began, my voice steadier than I expected, "I want to thank Thomas and Martha for welcoming me into your family with such genuine love and support. What you've built together over 40 years is beautiful, a partnership based on respect, kindness, and acceptance. I've learned more about what marriage should be from watching you two than from any other example in my life." Martha's eyes glistened with tears as she reached across the table to briefly touch my arm in solidarity. Thomas nodded encouragement, his expression a mix of concern and pride. I turned my attention to the table at large, no longer avoiding my mother's gaze. For those of you who don't know my mother well, what you just witnessed is a toned-down version of what I've heard my entire life. Nothing I do has ever been good enough, no accomplishment significant enough, no choice acceptable, unless it aligns with her very specific vision of success. Janet's mouth opened to interject, but I held up my hand, a gesture so uncharacteristically assertive that she actually stopped, momentarily shocked into silence. "When I was 7 years old, I brought home an A- on a math test. Most parents would be proud. Mine made me rewrite every problem I'd missed 20 times each, then tested me again at the kitchen table until midnight. When I was 12, I grew 2 inches over the summer and developed a slight stoop from suddenly being taller than my friends. My mother enrolled me in posture classes and made me practice walking with books on my head for an hour every day after school." I could see Robert shifting uncomfortably in his seat, these memories clearly painful for him as well, though he had done nothing to intervene at the time. At 15, I won a regional art competition. Instead of attending the award ceremony, my mother scheduled me for SAT prep classes that same day, telling me that real achievements would get me into college, not pretty pictures. By 18, I had developed such severe anxiety that I had my first panic attack during a college interview. The psychiatrist who treated me said it was one of the worst cases of perfectionism-induced anxiety he'd seen in a teenager. The table was utterly silent now, the anniversary celebration forgotten, as my long-suppressed truth poured out. Daniel stood and moved to my side, his hand resting supportively at the small of my back. His presence gave me the strength to continue. "But none of this is really about me," I said, my gaze fixed directly on Janet now. "It's about you, Mom. About the dreams you were forced to abandon, and the resentment you've carried all these years." Janet's face drained of color. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked its usual imperious certainty. "Yes, you do," I replied quietly. I found them when I was 16, the sketchbooks hidden in the attic storage boxes, dozens of them filled with extraordinary drawings and paintings, landscapes, portraits, studies of light and shadow, work that showed years of dedicated practice and natural talent. And tucked inside the last book, an acceptance letter from the Rhode Island School of Design dated 1972. Robert's head snapped up, his expression genuinely shocked. "What, Janet, you never told me you applied to art school?" Janet's hands were now the ones trembling as she clutched her napkin. "That was a lifetime ago. It wasn't important." "It was important enough that when I found those sketchbooks, you completely lost control." I continued, the memory still vivid after all these years. "You screamed at me for invading your privacy, then took the books and burned them in the backyard fire pit. You told me never to mention them again, and we pretended the whole incident never happened." The silence in the room was deafening. Martha had tears streaming down her face now, while Thomas looked at Janet with new understanding in his eyes. "Your parents made you turn down that acceptance, didn't they?" I asked, my voice gentler now. "They forced you to attend business school instead, to pursue a respectable career rather than follow your passion, and you've resented it your entire life." Janet's lips pressed into a thin white line, but she didn't deny it. "So when I showed artistic talent, it wasn't just disappointment you felt. It was rage. How dare I pursue what you were denied? How dare I choose freedom when you chose security and respectability? Every time I picked up a paintbrush, it reminded you of what you'd lost, what you'd surrendered, and you couldn't bear it." "You have no idea what you're talking about," Janet whispered, but the fight had gone out of her voice. "I understand more than you think," I said. "I found the letter, Mom. I've kept it all these years." I reached into my purse and withdrew a folded yellowed paper, the acceptance letter I'd rescued from the burning pile when she wasn't looking. "Your art professor called you one of the most promising young talents I've encountered. He predicted a significant artistic career if you continued to develop your gifts." Janet stared at the letter in my hand as if it were a snake about to strike. Robert looked at his wife with new eyes, decades of her behavior suddenly cast in a different light. "Janet," he said softly, "why didn't you ever tell me?" She didn't answer him, her eyes still fixed on the letter in my hand. "I'm not a failure, Mom," I said, finally, my voice steady and clear. "I'm just the person you never had the courage to be." Janet stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Without a word, she grabbed her purse and coat, then walked out of the dining room. The front door slammed moments later, the sound reverberating through the stunned silence. Robert sat frozen for several seconds, looking lost and decades older than he had at the beginning of the evening. "I should," he began, gesturing vaguely toward the door. He turned to Thomas and Martha. "I'm so sorry for this. Please accept my apologies." "There's nothing for you to apologize for, Robert," Martha said gently. Robert nodded distractedly, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Regret, perhaps, or resignation. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said, then followed my mother's path out of the house, his steps heavy and slow. As the front door closed behind him, I suddenly felt all the strength leave my body. My knees buckled slightly, and Daniel guided me back to my chair. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving me shaky and drained. "I'm so sorry," I said to the table at large, tears finally spilling over. "I've ruined your anniversary dinner." "You haven't ruined anything," Thomas said firmly. "Some truths need to be spoken no matter the occasion." Martha came around the table and wrapped her arms around me in a maternal embrace that broke the last of my resolve. I sobbed against her shoulder, decades of suppressed pain finding release. "Let it out, sweetheart," she murmured, stroking my hair. "You've been carrying this for far too long." The other guests quietly excused themselves, Kate promising to call the next day, the others offering gentle words of support as they departed. Soon, only the Coopers, Daniel, and I remained. "I had no idea," Daniel said once we were alone, his face etched with concern. "I mean, I knew your relationship with your mother was strained, but I never realized the extent of it." "I didn't want you to know," I admitted, wiping my eyes. I was ashamed. I thought if I just tried harder, if I could somehow be good enough, she would finally accept me. "There was nothing wrong with you to begin with," Thomas said, his voice gruff with emotion. Some people are so wounded themselves that they can't help but wound others, especially those closest to them. Daniel drove us home in silence, reaching across the console occasionally to squeeze my hand. When we arrived, our babysitter reported that Lily had gone to sleep easily with no concerns. After she left, Daniel and I sat at our kitchen table, the events of the evening hanging heavy between us. "Are you okay?" he asked finally. I considered the question carefully. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I feel emptied out, like something that was poisoning me for years has finally been drained away." "I'm proud of you," Daniel said, taking my hands in his. "What you did tonight took incredible courage." "I don't feel courageous. I feel like I just blew up my entire family." "Maybe it needed to be blown up," Daniel suggested gently. "Maybe this is the only way something healthier can grow in its place." I leaned my head against his shoulder, exhaustion settling over me like a heavy blanket. "I just wish I hadn't done it at your parents' anniversary dinner." "Trust me, this will go down as the most memorable anniversary they've ever had," Daniel said, attempting to lighten the mood. "And for what it's worth, Dad texted me that they're honored you felt safe enough in their home to speak your truth." The days that followed were surreal. Janet sent a series of texts oscillating between defensive anger, "How dare you humiliate me like that?" and attempts to rewrite what had happened. "You completely misunderstood everything I was trying to do for you." I didn't respond to any of them, needing time to process my own emotions before engaging with hers. On the third day, Robert called. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice weary. "Many apologies, in fact. I knew how she treated you wasn't right, but I told myself it was just her way of pushing you toward success. I should have protected you, Philomena. I failed you as a father." "You didn't fail me," I said, though part of me felt he had. "You were caught in her web, too." "That's no excuse," he replied. "I confronted her about the art school after we got home that night. She finally told me everything. How her parents had threatened to cut her off completely if she pursued art instead of a respectable career. How she'd given up her passion to please them and had regretted it ever since." "That's tragic," I said, meaning it despite everything. "But it doesn't excuse what she did to me." "No, it doesn't," he agreed. "She's not in a good place right now, Philomena. Finding out that you've kept that letter all these years, having her secret exposed like that, it's forced her to confront decisions she made 50 years ago that shaped her entire life. She's angry and hurt, but mostly I think she's devastated by the realization of what she's done to you." I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me felt vindicated that Janet was finally facing the consequences of her actions. Another part, the daughter who had desperately sought her approval for 31 years, still ached at the thought of her pain. A week after the dinner, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was Grace calling from a hotel room where she was attending a medical conference. "Phil," she said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I heard about what happened at the Coopers' dinner." "Mom called you," I said, not a question. "Dad, actually. He's worried about her, but he's worried about you too." And she paused. "I wanted to check on you myself." Our relationship had grown increasingly distant over the years. We exchanged birthday and Christmas gifts, saw each other at obligatory family gatherings, but rarely spoke one-on-one. Her call surprised me. "I'm okay," I said, still processing everything, but okay. "I need to tell you something," Grace said. "Something I should have told you years ago." She took a deep breath. "I was never as perfect as Mom made it seem. The straight A's, the awards, the acceptances to elite programs, they all came at a terrible cost. I was having panic attacks by the time I was 14. In college, I developed an eating disorder trying to maintain her standards of perfection. Even now, with a successful career and a perfect family, I take anxiety medication just to function day to day." I listened in stunned silence as my seemingly flawless sister unraveled years of pretense. "I was so jealous of you," she continued, her voice breaking. "You found the courage to pursue what you loved despite her disapproval. I've spent my entire life chasing her approval, and you know what? It's never enough. It's never going to be enough." "Grace, I had no idea," I said, my heart aching for the sister I'd resented for so long. I always thought you had it all figured out. She laughed a sad sound. That was the illusion I had to maintain. Do you know how many times I've thought about quitting medicine? I don't even enjoy it anymore. I chose it to please Mom, and now I'm trapped in a life that looks perfect from the outside but feels empty inside. It's never too late to make changes, I said. Maybe, she replied, not sounding convinced. But the point is, you were right to stand up to her. What you did was brave, Phil. I wish I had half your courage. Her words stayed with me in the weeks that followed, shifting my perspective on not just my relationship with my mother, but with my sister as well. The golden child and the failure, both victims of the same impossible standards, just coping in different ways. The evening of my gallery opening arrived with no word from either of my parents. I tried to focus on the excitement of the moment. My first solo exhibition at a prestigious gallery, a significant step in my career. Daniel's parents drove in for the event, bringing flowers and their unwavering support. Friends and colleagues filled the space. Champagne flowed, and several pieces sold before the night was half over. I was discussing one of my larger works with a potential buyer when I felt a presence beside me. Turning, I found my father standing there looking uncomfortable, but determined in a suit that seemed slightly too formal for the occasion. "Dad," I said, surprised, "I didn't know you were coming." "I wouldn't miss it," he replied, then awkwardly added, "I'll wait until you're finished here." After concluding the sale, I approached him uncertain of what to say. He solved the dilemma by pulling me into an uncharacteristic hug. "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "These are extraordinary, Philomena. Truly extraordinary." "Thank you," I replied, moved by his genuine appreciation. "Is Mom—" He shook his head. "She's not ready, but she's trying to understand some things about herself. She started seeing a therapist, actually. I think what happened at the dinner shook something loose in her that's been stuck for a very long time." I nodded, feeling a complex mixture of sadness and hope. "I'm glad she's getting help." "She asked me to give you this," he said, handing me a small envelope. "She said not to open it until after the exhibition." The envelope weighed on me throughout the remainder of the evening, its contents a mystery I both craved and dreaded. When the last guest had departed, and the gallery owner had congratulated me on a successful opening, I finally sat in a quiet corner and opened it. Inside was a check for an amount that made my eyes widen, and a brief note in Janet's precise handwriting. "For Lily's college fund, no strings attached. Use it for art school or whatever else she chooses. Her path should be her own." It wasn't an apology, not directly. But coming from Janet, it was an acknowledgement of sorts. A recognition that the cycle needed to end, that Lily deserved what neither of us had fully received the freedom to choose her own path without conditions. It's been a year since that fateful dinner where everything changed. A year of painful conversations, tentative reconciliations, and slow, imperfect healing. My career has flourished in ways I could barely have imagined. The exhibition led to features in several art publications, commissions from collectors across the country, and an invitation to teach weekend workshops at a respected art institute. Each success feels sweeter for being entirely on my own terms, untainted by anyone else's expectations. My relationship with Robert has deepened into something genuine and supportive. Freed from his role as peacekeeper between Janet and me, he's revealed a warmth and playfulness I rarely saw in childhood. He visits regularly, delighting in being a hands-on grandfather to Lily, reading her stories and taking her to the park without Janet's supervision or criticism. "I miss so much with you and Grace," he told me recently, watching Lily splash in a puddle after a spring rain. "I was so focused on keeping the peace that I forgot to enjoy being a father. I won't make that mistake as a grandfather." The road with Janet has been rockier as expected. After 3 months of silence following the dinner, she reached out and asked if we could meet, just the two of us on neutral ground. We sat in a quiet cafe, both nervous and guarded. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." She began, her usually perfect appearance, slightly softened, less rigid somehow. "And a lot of therapy, more than I ever thought I would need." She took a sip of her tea, hands slightly unsteady. "I won't pretend I understand or agree with all your choices, Philomena. but I am trying to understand why I react to them the way I do. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. We've established a fragile new pattern since then. Monthly lunches, where we carefully navigate toward a relationship built on something other than criticism and resentment. Some days are better than others. Sometimes the old Janet emerges with a cutting remark or a comparison that makes me tense. But now I can set boundaries calmly, stating that I won't accept that kind of comment. And surprisingly, she usually backs down. The most significant change came when she attended one of my smaller exhibitions 4 months ago. She walked slowly from piece to piece, studying each one with an intensity that made me nervous. "You have a distinctive style," she said finally. "The way you use light. It reminds me of how I used to approach my landscapes." It was the first time she had ever voluntarily referenced her own artistic past. "Would you ever consider painting again?" I asked cautiously. She was quiet for so long I thought she wouldn't answer. "I might," she said eventually. "I've been thinking about it. After 50 years, I'm not sure I even remember how." "It's not something you forget," I told her. "Not if it was part of you." The next week, a package arrived at my studio. A high-quality set of acrylic paints and brushes. The card simply read, "Maybe we could paint together sometime. Mom." We haven't yet, but the invitation remains open. Small steps. Grace and I have developed a closeness that never existed before. Our shared experience of Janet's perfectionism has become a bond rather than a wedge between us. She's made some changes in her life too, cutting back her medical practice to part-time starting therapy, even taking a ceramics class just because it looks fun. "You inspired me," she told me during a recent visit. "Watching you live authentically despite Mom's disapproval made me realize I could make different choices too." As for Daniel and his family, they remain my rock and safe harbor. Thomas and Martha never once made me feel that I had ruined their anniversary with my outburst. Instead, Martha told me that speaking my truth was the most precious gift anyone could have given us, the trust to be authentic in our home. Lily continues to grow into a confident, creative child who knows she is loved unconditionally. When she shows me her finger paintings or the wobbly clay sculptures she makes at preschool, I see the pure joy of creation unshadowed by worry about whether it's good enough. I make sure to praise her effort and enthusiasm rather than the result, to ask her about the process rather than evaluating the product. Sometimes when she's particularly proud of something she's made, she asks if we can show it to Grandma Janet. Those moments still give me pause, but I'm learning to separate my own childhood wounds from my daughter's fresh, unbiased relationship with her grandmother. Janet, to her credit, has never once criticized Lily's artistic efforts, perhaps recognizing the generational damage she could inflict if she did. The truth I spoke that night at the dinner table didn't just change my relationship with my mother, it changed my relationship with myself. The shame I had carried for decades, the constant sense of not measuring up, the fear of judgment that colored every decision. All of it began to lose its power the moment I stood up and claimed my story. Healing isn't linear, of course. There are still days when I hear Janet's critical voice in my head, when I doubt my choices or my worth. But those voices grow fainter with time and practice. I've learned to recognize them as echoes from the past, rather than truths about the present. The most profound lesson in all of this has been about the nature of courage. It wasn't fearlessness that enabled me to speak up that night. It was the willingness to act, despite the fear to risk rejection and conflict, for the sake of authenticity. And paradoxically, by speaking the truth that I thought might destroy my family, I created the possibility for something healthier to grow in its place. We're not a perfect family now. Far from it. But we're a more honest one. The facades have cracked, allowing light into places that were dark for too long. Janet is confronting demons she's carried for half a century. Robert is finding his voice after decades of silence. Grace is questioning the perfect life she built to please others. And I am finally truly free to be exactly who I am, without apology or justification. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for others, is to tell a truth that hurts. Not to wound, but to heal. Not to destroy, but to create space for something authentic to grow. My hands trembled that night as I stood up to speak, but my voice grew stronger with every word. And in that strength, I found not just liberation for myself, but the possibility of liberation for everyone at that table. Have you ever had to stand up to family who couldn't see your worth? Share your experience in the comments below. If this story helped you feel less alone, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that they're not a failure either. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, speaking your truth isn't just an act of courage, it's an act of healing.